This is the third video that we'll be releasing alongside Limber version 2. The first one covers the basics, the second one was all about animation modes, and this one's all about limb layers and how to handle them after you've made them. In the first video I showed you how to add artwork into limbs when you first make them with the new limb panel, and now we're going to look at how to add artwork into an existing limb. I'm going to add these hair layers to the orc's right arm. I'll select the artwork for the lower section and a layer from the limb, and then I'll click Limber's Add Art button. Limber embeds all the art into the limb layer's lower section, and now it moves and stretches along with the arm. To add art to the upper section of the limb, you just do exactly the same thing, but you need to hold Alt or Option when you click the Add Art button. You can add more than one art layer at a time, and I'll show you that using the other arm. I'll select the layers for the left arm's shoulder plate, bandages and hair, and then a layer from the limb, and again hold Alt when I click the Add Art button so that it goes in the upper section. When I move the arm around, I don't like the way that the shoulder plate is stretching. I want it to move with the limb but stay in a rigid shape. If I twirl down the limb layer contents, I can see the art as a series of shape groups with the same names that the original layers had, so I can change the stacking order and edit things, or just delete them, which is what I'll do to the shoulder plate. The original art layer is still here in the timeline because I have this delete artwork after rigging setting turned off here in my settings. If you need artwork to be rigid, or if you need it to stick to a limb with curvature, the solution is to parent it to a locator rather than adding it into the limb itself. If I select the limb start controller before I click the locator button, Limber will automatically place the new locator at the start point of the limb. So now I can just parent the shoulder plate to that, and as I move the limb around, it'll rotate properly, but it won't stretch. If I turn up the limb's curvature property here, you can see that the shoulder plate is going to follow that curve, which the added art can't do. If you need art to be both stretchy and curvy, then you're probably best to plan ahead and use a puppet limb, but we'll cover those in another video. Another reason to parent art to a locator instead of adding it into the limb is if you need it to stay hanging down as the limb moves around. So for these hanging bands, I'll add another locator, set its section to upper and its location to roughly where the bands start from, and then I'll turn down the auto rotate property on the locator to 0 before parenting the bands layer to it. I'll drag the bands layer below the limb layer in the timeline, and then it sticks to the limb at the right point without auto-rotating. Later on, I could animate it swinging from side to side by keyframing the locator's rotation offset property. Precomp limbs were introduced with Limber version 2, and they've been designed to work as closely as possible to the way that shape layer limbs work. But there are a few important differences, apart from the fact that they can use raster layers. When you make a precomp limb, like this, the comp that is the limb layer is placed in a folder at the root of your project called Limber Limbs. You can change the name of that folder in the settings here if you want to. I'm going to quickly make a new path limb here and then use the duplicate button with it just to show you that with shape layer limbs, when you make a duplicate limb, it's just a copy. If I change its color, the color of the original limb won't change because they're disconnected from one another. But with precomp limbs, that's not the case. And let me show you what I mean. I'll select the end controller for the bird's leg that I made, click duplicate, and then move the new controllers over to where I want them and drag the layers up in the stack so they're between the body and the wing. I have this art layer of 2 white bands for the back leg. So I'll select it and the back leg layer and use the Add Art button to embed it in the limb. But you can see that the bands now appear in both legs because they're both instances of the same source precomp. Now sometimes that's what you want and sometimes it's not. So now I'm going to show you how to make a duplicate precomp limb that's totally independent from the original. First I'll undo the Add Art, and then I'll identify the limb's source comp by right-clicking on it and going to Reveal Layer Source in Project. That takes me over to the project panel where I can hit Ctrl or Command D to natively duplicate the comp. I'll rename it something appropriate. Then I need to select the duplicate limb layer in the timeline and hold Alt as I click and drag the new comp from the project panel and drop it over the timeline. This is how you get After Effects to replace the limb layer with the new comp. And now, if I go and add art again, this time it only appears in one leg. You can add art layers into a Precomp limb manually rather than using the Add Art button. I'll take this armband layer, hit Command X to cut it, double-click the limb layer for the wing, and paste it inside the Precomp. The end, lower art parent, and upper art parent layers are the pivots of a Precomp limb, and any art layers have to be parented to them so that they rotate and scale when the limb is animated. The armband is on the lower section of the wing, so I'll parent it to the lower art parent layer, set its alpha mat, and then test it out back in the main comp. I can see that the two wing sections are not pivoting around a good point because one sticks out when the wing bends. To adjust pivots, I need to go back into the Precomp, unlock the pivot layers, take my anchor point tool by hitting Y, and move the anchor point to where I want the pivot to go. Then I need to click Limber's Reset button, which resets the pivot layers and kind of recalibrates the limb. Back in the main comp, it works better. The Reset button has a second function for resetting Precomp limb durations. If I make this comp longer, my Precomp limbs aren't long enough to reach the end anymore. But I can select one and hold Alt or Option when I click the Reset button, and Limber extends the Precomp and the controllers for that limb. If I want to do all the limbs in the comp, I can just select all the layers and Alt or Option click the Reset button again. And if I want to reset the durations for every Precomp limb in my entire project, I can select them in the project panel and again hold Alt or Option and click the Reset button. When you reset durations like this, Limber goes and finds all the comps that each Precomp limb is used in, and it will match the duration of the longest one. Any other layers inside the Precomp limb will be extended if they were active on the last frame. So if you've trimmed any art layers down, like this, then they won't get extended. Don't forget the Limber has a very good user guide at limber.docs.animatable.co. But if you do have any questions, you can just pop a comment down below or get hold of me in our Discord channel. Otherwise, I will see you next time.